Thank you for having me talk about Tibor Rubin, a GI of incomparable courage and character. Tibor, or Tibor, it's pronounced both ways, Hungarian, spent 4 years in close physical conflict with the Nazi SS and with the North Korean and Chinese armies. Okay. During his 3 years in Korea, he would earn, but not receive, at least 2 Silver Stars and the Medal of Honor not once, not twice, but 3 times. Okay? 3 separate occasions he should have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Ultimately, 50 years later, he did receive 1 Medal of Honor with the most extraordinary citation, I think, that has ever been written up for a Medal of Honor recipient. Okay? Now, what's going to happen here is that I'm time limited, and I would like to introduce you all to Tibor as a person and also talk about what he did in the context of where and when he did it. And what's going to happen is that I hope you'll get a feel for this guy. Some of it is really quite nitty-gritty, even for a group of veterans like yourselves. And somewhere along the line, somebody's going to tell me to stop. And I'll stop before I'm finished, before I get through everything that he did by the time he was released as a prisoner of war in 1953. But I hope, again, to give you a feel for this guy that goes beyond just sort of enumerating what he should have been awarded all these medals for. Tibor was born in a small town in Hungary. At the age of 14, he was thrown into the Mauthausen concentration camp. Mauthausen was actually an archipelago of camps where the prisoners were starved and worked to death in mines, quarries, and tunnels. Okay? They were digging the kinds of tunnels and basically mining granite for the kinds of places where Hitler thought he was going to build V-2s and Me-262s and the other protected high-tech weapon systems. Okay? The working conditions were insufferable. The SS there were particularly brutal. This was a slave labor camp, different from most of the other camps most of you are familiar with, not like Auschwitz or Treblinka were extermination camps where the SS were largely factory foremen. This was a camp where the SS was particularly brutal and essentially worked people to death under the worst possible conditions. Okay? So Tibor shows up as a 14-year-old in the spring of 1944, and he's put to work with a couple of people who were captured with him, who were tradesmen building one of the sub-camps. And they had a woodpile as part of the construction effort for one of the many sub-camps of Mauthausen. And what they did was hollow out a little cavity in this big woodpile, big enough for this little 14-year-old. He was small for his size. Okay? He was not about, by the way, to go into a teenage growth spurt, given the conditions he was in, or the conditions he lived under since 1939 when the war began in Europe. And Tibor would be placed inside the little cavity in this woodpile at night, and he would come out at night, and what he would do was sneak into the SS compound yes, sneak into the SS compound where they had their barracks, where they had their mess hall. And he would sneak up behind a big, basically oil drum garbage barrel. And he would reach over the top of that garbage barrel, and he would take anything he could get his hands on and bring it back to the little cavity in the woodpile. I'll go into a little bit more detail in this. What you need to understand is that in a concentration camp like this, and it would hold for the POW camps that he would be part of in the Korean War, is that starvation was part of the way the camps were run. And the prisoners would get to the point where they could think of nothing more than basically what they were starving to death. And what Tibor would get, the garbage out of this oil drum by the SS mess hall, a form of life beyond what the vast majority of the prisoners in Mauthausen would have. He got good at this. He developed a sense of what we today would call situation awareness. If he was caught doing this, he was a dead man, or a dead child, actually. Okay? I mean, there would just have been no thought given to just killing this guy for actually having the temerity to sneak into an SS compound. Okay? He got to the point where he understood what it would take to get there and get back, and would tie up the sleeves of his shirt and the ankles of his pants, and he would pull whatever he could out of this trash barrel, and he would fill his pants and he would fill his shirt with enough food to help the fellow prisoners who knew what he was doing. And he would come back to his little cavity, and they would get him in the morning, and he would share this food in a very careful manner with the people that knew what he was doing and was helping him out. And I want you to remember this scenario. I won't go into any further aspects of what happened to him in Mauthausen. Okay, but remember this scenario. He was liberated, all of Mauthausen was liberated, by the 11th Armored Division, May 5th, 1945. Okay, it was very interesting. Liberation was quite unusual. The inmates managed to put together an American flag to welcome the GIs with. Okay? Tibor was, as was the case with most of the prisoners who survived, was an absolute physical basket case. Okay? You can imagine being starved for almost a year, worked under these conditions for almost a year, and there are pictures. I actually have one here. The picture in the upper right-hand corner there is of the liberation of the main Mauthausen camp, but the pictures of the survivors show absolute skeletons, people who couldn't stand, people who were going to die in the short order and what have you. And this now 15-year-old kid was in that condition. But he was incredibly impressed by the Americans who liberated them. And contrary to their orders, the medical staff of the U.S. Army who were there when the camp was liberated tried to help some of the prisoners out. And in particular, they, and one red-headed nurse in particular, helped bring Tibor back. It took months and months and months. You can't imagine what kind of condition this 15-year-old was in after spending something like 14 months in this place. Okay? And he was nursed back to some form of health so that he could be placed into a displaced persons camp. Okay? He managed to come over because he had a relative in the United States. He managed to come over to the United States. And what he wanted to do when he was here, I mean, he was a totally uneducated kid, right? Okay. He may have gone to through the equivalent of 6th grade in a Hungarian school in a small town, okay, in wartime Hungary, okay? He was barely literate in Hungarian, and he was totally illiterate in everything else, okay? But he was a smart guy. He developed this sense of situation awareness, and he had also developed a sense of, if you'd like, obligation and gratitude. And what he wanted to do after he got here was join the U.S. Army and pay back, which is just unheard of. People who basically survived this condition or the war more generally. And so he tried to enlist in the U.S. Army, and he kept getting turned down. He kept getting turned down because he couldn't pass the written test. And he wasn't a citizen. So he kept being told by the people in the recruiting offices that this is not your business. We don't really want you. And besides, you're failing the written test. And he kept trying. And he eventually found some recruiting sergeants who helped him get through, on the third try, the written test. So he gets into the U.S. Army. He figured he'd learn a trade. Okay, remember, this is this pretty illiterate fellow here who had just gone through all kinds of hell and barely spoke English, okay, certainly couldn't read it terribly well, had an incredibly thick Hungarian accent, and he thought he would do something like get into one of the Army trade schools. He had in mind, in particular, going to the butcher school in Chicago, and sort of learning a trade and paying back his obligations of gratitude to the U.S. Army, and that would be that. He'd go on to a life in the United States. Okay. Well, as soon as he completes basic training, the Korean War breaks out, June of 1950. Okay. He is shipped off as a replacement. He was trained as an infantryman, but he was shipped off as a replacement or to fill up the ranks of the 1st Cavalry Division. And the 1st Cavalry Division was one of the first units to go to Korea. And let me give you some context of what the Korean War looked like in the first 7 months, okay? It is one of the truly forgotten wars. I suspect, with all due respect, that most of you in this room don't have much of an idea of what the Korean War, it was a very mobile war for the first 7 months. And if we can move it, we did move it to the Korean Peninsula, okay? By the way, the term single-handed on the cover of that book that I showed there, which has one of the few pictures of Tibor as a healthy guy in a uniform, the term single-handed is not a term that he ever applied to himself. It comes from the eventual Medal of Honor citation that he did get 50 years later. In any case, what you see there is a map of the Korean Peninsula. And what you see is the North Korean attack as of starting in June 25th of 1950, moving its way down all the way to Busan in the corner. Can you get Busan? Thank you very much, Skip. Appreciate that. Basically, the U.S. and fairly quickly the United Nations forces were essentially pushed all the way to that small enclave around Busan and pretty much ready to be pushed into the sea. Okay? The 1st Cavalry Division was one of the first sizable units to be sent to Busan. Truman basically said, we're going to hold on to what we can, got the UN to agree, and so we stuffed what we could into the Busan perimeter. Now, what I'm going to describe 3 periods in the first 7 or 8 months of the Korean War, and then I'm going to relate what Tibor did during these first 7 months to each of those periods. The first period is the one with the North Korean attack, okay? And essentially with us defending the Busan perimeter, and trying to hold off from being pushed completely off of the peninsula. Okay? So it was a holding action for some months. until September of 1950. In September of 1950, MacArthur basically came up with a left hook at Incheon. Can you get me Incheon a little further down? Right around there, okay? So we landed at Incheon. Among the units that landed was the 1st Marine Division, okay? But there were other units as well. And as you can tell from that map, and this audience will appreciate this without any problem, that if you put a big force in there, you are about to cut the peninsula in half and essentially trap the North Korean army south of what was really close to originally the 38th parallel. So the second phase, first phase was defending and holding on to the Pusan perimeter and trying to move forward a little bit. Second phase is the North Koreans are in full retreat, and MacArthur is trying to basically get all the UN forces, and in particular the US forces, all the way up to the Yellow River, okay, and essentially wipe North Korea off the map. The third phase that basically occurred in these first 7 months is that the Chinese intervened. And the Chinese intervened in force in November. There's a lot of controversy there about how we got incredibly surprised by that, where we shouldn't have been. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers from the PLA basically coming in to save North Korea. And this phase basically started in November of 1950, when the US forces were really quite close to the Yellow River across the entire width of the peninsula, okay? So, let's back up with Tibor. First phase, first Medal of Honor activity. One of the problems that Tibor had was that he had a first sergeant. He was an I Company, iota company of the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. Okay, he was a private. Okay, he was just a grunt, and he was a grunt who barely spoke English. He was the smallest guy in his outfit. He was whatever he was. But he was something that his first sergeant, he's actually a master sergeant, but he's essentially the first sergeant of the company, was a rabid anti-Semite. Okay. And basically what this guy would do was send Tibor off on all kinds of missions with the apparent intent that he wouldn't come back. Okay. The problem is that he was dealing with a guy who had developed this sense of situation awareness under really extreme circumstances, and Tibor kept coming back. Okay. So in any case, in one of these defensive situations where I Company, I'll call it I of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, 381 if you'd like. And they were holding a hill with a ridge, okay? At one point in defending, this is further up from Pusan, they had made some progress moving out of the Pusan peninsula, perimeter. And there was this ridge on this hill, and I Company was holding this hill and this ridge, and they had dug all these defensive positions. They were expecting a North Korean attack, and they dug a bunch of foxholes and all this sort of stuff along the ridge. And they had just received a whole bunch of, basically they piled up a small arms ammo dump for the company to use in the expected North Korean offensive. Okay. So in any case, the whole battalion, the whole regiment was going to be pulled back. Okay. And the company gets pulled back, and they had no means of moving that ammo dump. Okay. And so the first sergeant says, Tibor, you stay here with the ammo dump. All the rest of us are going to go back. We're going to find a truck. and we're going to come out here, and in a couple hours we're going to pick you and all the basically the small arms, ammunition and weapons and what have you in this ammo dump, and we're going to bring you back with the rest of us. So they go away, and hours pass, and there is Tibor with all of these weapons and ammunition, and just Tibor, and it's getting dark. And he didn't know what to do. Well, actually, he figured out what to do. He wasn't going to abandon his position. Okay? It might have actually made sense because the North Koreans were desperate for the kind of weaponry and ammunition in that ammo dump to have destroyed that. But that didn't seem to occur to him. What he did was to essentially empty a large part of that ammo dump and distribute, especially the very large number of hand grenades they had in that dump, in all the foxholes along the ridge. Okay? And then he set up 2 of these 30 caliber machine guns, which most of you are familiar with. They're the same 30 caliber light machine guns, platoon machine guns that were used in World War II. Typically a 2-man weapon with 1 person feeding the belt, 250 rounds per belt, something like that, and 1 gunner. And he set up 2 of these machine guns, and he put whatever weapons he could, but especially those hand grenades, in all of these foxholes along this ridge. And he just sat there wondering what was going on. It was dark, and it was cloudy. There was a full moon out there, but it was very cloudy, and it was really dark. Okay? And Tibor looks over this ridge, and he didn't know what's down there. Okay? And he's getting really scared, and it's getting well into the night. Okay? He's ultimately going to spend 24 hours, close to 24 hours alone on that ridge. Okay? Now he knows, he's had a whole lot of experience already with the North Korean Army, with the Inmun, they call them, and he knows they're likely to attack during the night, especially close to dawn, but before daylight, before the U.S. could put planes in the air. Okay? And he's there, and he's really getting nervous. And there's a break in the clouds, and the moon put some light down on the valley below this hill, and he sees lots and lots and lots of North Koreans. Okay? Whatever number of them, probably at least a company, because they were expecting to attack a whole U.S. First Cav company defending the hill. And as soon as the light shone on them, they started moving up the hill. And then it got dark again. Okay? And Tibor essentially goes into a high energy mode where he goes from foxhole to foxhole. And he pulls the pins on these grenades. And he starts flinging them over the side. Okay? He starts firing whatever M1 carbines, M1 Garans that were around. He mans the 2 machine guns. He, by himself, basically gets behind one of these 30 calibers, and he goes through a belt or 2 or what have you. He was actually pretty good at this. They didn't jam on him. I mean, these things had a real tendency to jam. That's why they had 2 people. And he does the 2 machine, and he does this for some length of time. Okay? He had no idea what time was going on. He was getting into a state of total mental and physical exhaustion. Those of you who have combat experience probably can have some idea of what this guy was doing all by himself for hour after hour. We have no idea really how much time he was alone actually in combat like this, but he was flinging grenades and shooting whatever he could over the side of that ridge. He felt confident under these circumstances, how can he be confident in anything, that they thought there was a whole lot more than him up there on that ridge. Okay. And so this is what he did until light started to come out. Okay. And you could hear planes. Okay. And the North Koreans disappeared. Okay. At this stage of the game, Tibor is a total basket case physically and mentally. You can imagine what this guy went through. Those of you who have had any sort of combat experience close up with the enemy know how incredibly stressful that can be. It is unimaginable, at least to me, how he could have done this. Okay? And he was unwounded, okay? But he was a total basket case physically and mentally. With daylight, some of the people came back from my company. They brought a truck, okay? He met them. He was this sort of babbling. Nobody could understand him anyway because of his thick Hungarian accent. And nobody knew what the hell he was talking about until some people looked over the side of this ridge. And he had completely shredded at least a company of North Koreans. Okay? His final Medal of Honor citation, which gives like one sentence to this, okay, is they use the term staggering number of enemy casualties. I don't think anybody ever counted it. And so the company commander says, we got to write this guy up for a Medal of Honor. Okay? His first sergeant, he said, I'm not going to write up nothing. And the company commander is killed a few days later, and it's completely forgotten. Tibor was offered the opportunity for R&R. It was sent you off to Tokyo. I mean, you got to have some sort of way to recover from this. I mean, the guy, again, was mentally and physically a total basket case. Okay. But he said, no, I'll be okay, and I'll stick with the company, and I'll be okay. And he did not pick up on the R&R. He did not press the Medal of Honor. I'm not sure that he had any idea what anybody was saying when they saw what he had done. Okay, he was just completely out of it in every sense. Okay, and that was all there was to it, at least until some of the people many, many years later said, why didn't this guy get anything for this? Okay. Let's move up a stage to where we are now in a post-Incheon landing situation in Korea. Okay? So U.S. and UN forces are moving northward towards the Yellow River. The 1st Cavalry Division, by the way, was going to be the first large U.S. unit to enter Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. Okay? And the 1st Cav, along with the rest of the U.S. forces, was moving up along, if you'd like, the left-hand side of the peninsula. Okay? And they were just pushing the North Koreans wherever. I'll just mention one episode here for his 2nd Medal of Honor nomination that was not pursued. Tibor was sent out on his own. Okay? Again, he was always sort of on his own, but he had developed this incredible sense of situation awareness. And he was sent out on his own to basically reconnoiter for the company. He finds himself in some woods, and he finds himself in the middle of a whole lot of North Koreans. Hundreds of North Koreans and him. Okay? I'll cut this story short so we can get on with a little bit more of this. But basically the end result is that he talked them all into surrendering. And he comes back to the company with hundreds of North Koreans. Okay? And the Medal of Honor citation, nobody counted them. Basically, the Medal of Honor citation, which is really quite extraordinary, says hundreds of North Korean prisoners. Okay? He brings them in, okay, and he had to sort of protect them from the abuse of the people in his own company. Okay, they surrendered under sort of positive understanding, if you'd like. Okay, Tibor, God only knows how this guy, who basically was semi-literate in English, had a thick Hungarian accent, was talking to North Korean officers who spoke only Korean, and somehow or other he pulled this off, and he brought them all in. Okay. Let's move up to just about the beginning of the third phase, when the Chinese enter. Okay. So he's out there with his company, with the 3rd Battalion of the 8th of the 1st, and they're up by Insam. Could we have the 3rd map? Ah, you've got the 3rd map. Hey, you're really good at this, Sim. I tell you, can you sort of get Insam a little further up, and yeah, sort of in there, okay? So there's this town called Insam, and this is where the battalion is, and this is where the Chinese, at the beginning of November, basically clobber the entire battalion. Okay. When the Chinese entered, they beat the hell out of all the U.S. forces. Okay, I won't go into any sort of details about why didn't we know better, and why weren't we prepared for this. This is all the way across. I mean, there's 2 U.S. divisions in particular, the 1st Cav and the 2nd Infantry, got beat up something awful on the left side. The whole 10th Corps got beat up on the right side of the peninsula, including the 1st Marine Division, where our own Georgia Tech Ray Davis earned a Medal of Honor at the Chosin Reservoir. But in any case, 3rd Battalion was completely overrun by the Chinese. Okay. I just might point out on the side, I can give a whole additional talk on this, that the battalion chaplain, a Catholic priest by the name of Emil Capon, K-A-P-A-U-N, earned, but did not receive at the time, but did many years later, a Medal of Honor for his battlefield activities basically as a battlefield chaplain of extraordinary courage when the battalion was being overrun. Tibor deserved at least the Silver Star for what he did when it was overrun. But in any case, just about everybody in the battalion was killed, captured, or, including the 1st Sergeant, they bugged out, as the term of the day. The captured U.S. soldiers were put, along with what the Chinese picked up elsewhere from the 1st Cavalry Division, were basically put on a kind of baton death march, B-A-T-A-A-N. Those of you familiar with what happened to the Philippines at the beginning of the U.S. entry in World War II in the Pacific side. And there was a death march basically uphill to a small little set of huts and what have you, a former mining town. And they were walking uphill in what has been termed the coldest winter. David Halberstam wrote a book, probably one of the best single-volume histories of the Korean War, called The Coldest Winter. And it was an incredibly brutal winter. And so all of these prisoners who were not well clothed for this were essentially marched up by the North Koreans and the Chinese. It was mostly a Chinese effort, but the North Koreans were there too, at least for this first part of it. And they were essentially marched up to this small camp for prisoners that the prisoners would call Death Valley. And on the way up, 2 of the people who really saved a number of lives because, as with the Bataan Death March in the Philippines in 1942, basically anybody who fell to the side was killed by the guards. Okay? So Tibor and Father Emil were two of the people who basically kept pulling people up as they fell down, kept getting them to hang in there, keep going. And they managed to get to this little camp, okay? And they were essentially put into these little huts that were part of this small mining town in North Korea. And they were being held there under really awful conditions. It was unbelievably cold and brutal out there. The enlisted and the officers were kept separate. In fact, the privates and corporals were kept separate from any of the NCOs. Basically, the Chinese would segregate for good reasons the lowest ranking people from the officers. And Tibor was essentially in a hut with about 18 other people. Okay. Within all, many of them wounded, including Tibor. Tibor was carrying around some shrapnel wounds here that had not been tended to. And they were in this little hut. Within a couple days, Tibor figured out where the guards kept their food. Okay. Within a couple days, in the middle of the night, when nobody would be outside in this weather, okay, there was no worry about anybody escaping from this camp, by the way. Okay. Tibor would go out. He figured out where they kept the food. Okay. He broke into the little shacks where they kept the barrels of whatever roots and what have you that the guards ate for the most part. And he tied up the ankles of his pants, and he tied up the sleeves of his shirt, and he filled them up with the stuff that he took from the guard's food store. And he brought it back to his fellow hutmate, the other privates and corporals of this little group. And somehow or other, they all found themselves with more to eat than they ever imagined they could get. Okay? And he kept doing this. Okay? He would do other things while as a prisoner. They were, by the way, moved from this little camp to a larger camp right on the Yalu River in January. Okay, we're talking from November to January in the smaller camp. In January, up to something called Camp 5, okay, which was really an all-Chinese operation. North Koreans pretty much disappeared from this. And it was a larger camp. And there was another death march between the smaller camp and the larger camp. And Tibor and Father Emil both helped out to keep people going. Okay? They were in bad shape, both of them, but they really helped people out. Tibor would do various things. I'll just mention a couple of the things that he did besides helping to feed his fellow privates and corporals. Tibor was a private, by the way. They call him corporal. The day he was released, they made him a corporal. So he was a corporal for a couple of days after he got out. But in any case, there's one of his fellow company comrades, if you'd like, who was wounded in both shoulders. And there was no medical treatment there. It turned out to be a doctor in the camp, a guy by the name of Essenstein. But he was kept largely with the officers. And the enlisted never saw him, and who knows what would have happened. But Tibor, the guy was getting gangrene in both of his shoulders. He was doomed. Tibor goes out on one of his night missions, okay, and he finds where the North Koreans and the Chinese were piling up the dead people and the rotted meat, such as it was, from the camp. And what do you think he did with those bodies to help his friend out? Anybody? He collected maggots. Okay? Something he learned at Mauthausen. Okay? He collected maggots. Maggots feed on rotting tissue. He brought the maggots back. Nobody in his little hut had any clue what this guy was doing. And he dumped all these maggots into his friend's shoulder. Okay? And they ate all the gangrene. And the guy survived. Okay? Another instance. He had somebody who was basically giving up. All these starving prisoners are really inclined, just freezing, starving prisoners. It's so much easier just to give up and die. Okay? And he and Father Emile, when he could, Father Emile was one of the few officers there, by the way, who made any effort whatsoever to get in contact with the enlisted people. Okay? The Chinese tried to keep them separate. Emile would get through. Hardly any of the other officers really cared very much. But Emile was exemplary. Father Emile would die, by the way, in May at the next camp. He would die of dysentery and complications like many of the prisoners would die. But in any case, Tibor had somebody who was just about to give up. And so Tibor brings him these little pellets. Okay. And what are these little pellets? The little droppings of goat shit. Okay? That's his term. Okay? It's interesting. In one of the interviews of Tibor, this is the term he uses. Little goat shit droppings. And he tells the guy that the Red Cross was here. And they left the medicine to take care of your problems, okay? And you have to take this medicine on a regular basis, and you have to have a positive attitude, and you'll survive with this medicine. And the guy basically bought what Tibor had to say and ate the goat shit and pulled himself out of it and survived. So in any case, I should bring this to a halt. I know I've gone a bit over, okay? But basically, his third Medal of Honor was for everything he did as a prisoner of war. Okay? He had particular problems as a prisoner of war because as a Hungarian and a non-U.S. citizen, okay, he was approached by the Chinese who went to him and said, "Hey, what are you doing here with the U.S. Army? We're going to send you back to good old communist Hungary, and we'll, all expenses paid. Okay, you're going to be a free man in this forthcoming socialist paradise in Hungary, and you're good to go." Tibor said, "I don't want to go back. I see what your socialist paradise here is like. I have no desire to go back to Hungary. I have a pretty good idea of what that place was like at the end of the war and what's become of it now. I want to stay here with my American comrades, and I want to be a U.S. citizen." And they kept at him for years to try to get him to defect. And he kept saying no. Okay? I mean, he was singled out because of his Hungarian background and the fact that they were going to portray him as some sort of dupe of the Americans or what have you, who was fighting for this imperialist cause and all this crap. But in any case, he stuck with it. He was offered on several occasions opportunities to essentially have an easier life, not to mention being released and sent back to Hungary. He refused every time. Okay? And he stuck with it to the very end. I'll just say a couple of things about his Medal of Honor citation. Okay? I have a copy of it here. I also have a picture of what life looked like in Mauthausen, what the survivors looked like. He wasn't even in as good a shape as some of the survivors who were absolute skeletons who could barely stand. Tibor couldn't stand by the end of his time in Mauthausen. Okay? So a typical Medal of Honor citation is for an action of above and beyond, tremendous courage. I don't begrudge any Medal of Honor citation, but they're usually for something that lasted a few hours or a couple of days. Okay? There are very few for prisoners of war. Okay? But even in the cases where you have them, which were exceptional, for your war, it was James Stockdale who got a Medal of Honor, a Navy pilot who ultimately became, actually knew him after he retired, a three-star head of the Naval War College for his activity in the Hanoi Hilton, basically. And it was for one day. Stockdale did something. He almost killed himself, defacing himself, so that he wouldn't be used by the North Vietnamese for what have. And he deserved his Medal of Honor. It was for one day. Okay? Unusual for a POW to get a Medal of Honor. Okay? U.S. people were always suspicious of Americans who were supposedly hero in prison camps because they suspected them of being dupes of the communists and all this sort of stuff. But in any case, Tibor's citation is extraordinary in that all three of these Medal of Honor deserving, if you like, activities on his part, they're all lumped into this one Medal of Honor citation. And the dates of the citation cover 3 years, from July 1950 to April 1953. It is truly extraordinary. I've never seen it in any other case where a Medal of Honor citation, which always has the dates, that's anything close to 3 full years. And basically, each of the three Medal of Honor deserving, if you like, acts of courage and character and what have you, all of them are sort of lumped into this in one sentence here and one sentence there, and it sort of adds up to just one citation. 50 years later, the history of how he finally got it is actually in many ways very, very disturbing. But please, I never knew the guy or what have you, but he did manage to get it while he was still alive. He was 76 when he finally got the award. Okay, he was a little old man. The award was given by George W. Bush, who was not a giant in his own right, but you see them together, and Bush is a head and shoulders taller than Tibor. He was this little guy who essentially stopped growing at age 14 when he was thrown into Mauthausen. Okay, and with that, let me apologize for going probably a little long, but in any case, thank you for hearing me out. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Very quickly, do we have any questions, Dr. Goodman? Sorry, this was really interesting. Thank you, sir. Oh, okay. And we have something. I'm sorry?
What did he do after the Great War?
Not much. Well, look, he, like the case after he was released from Mauthausen, he was in terrible physical shape. And so he went through an extended period of medical recovery. And then he went to work in his brother's liquor store for much of the time. he had some GI. He got his citizenship, not right away. It took him, because he couldn't study for it. I mean, he couldn't cope with English. Became a citizen in, I think, November of '54, which was a very big deal for him. And he, like a young guy who had just basically gone through what he's gone through, he became a girl chaser, and he did a little bit of junior college GI Bill kind of thing for a semester or what have you. And he had a certain amount of Hollywood attention. He lived in Southern California. And he got tired of that, and he just basically settled down, got married, had kids, and was very close with his family, and eventually, I think, worked his way up to sales manager and partner in his brother's liquor store. Most of his family died during the Holocaust, his father, mother, and at least one sister. But his older brother, who he worshipped, basically survived, actually survived Mauthausen, and but is in better shape, a much bigger, stronger guy than Tibor was. And he just lived a life, never talked about this at all, and out of sort of almost accidentally in getting together, because he would take time to comfort people in VA hospitals in Southern California and what have you. He ran across some other Korean War veterans who remembered him and were astounded to hear that he got nothing except being a corporal for a couple of days. They started a campaign. They tried to find, I mean, they were dying off. A lot of them died during the war. But everybody who knew what he did was a shrinking set of people. But they kept after it. It was an amazing group of people, augmented by the Jewish war veterans, who essentially kept pursuing this until 50 years later, as almost accidentally, because another Jewish veteran by the name of Lenny Kravitz, you say, oh, Lenny Kravitz is a big-time black rock and roll Hall of Famer. No, not this. No, there's this little Lenny Kravitz, who's a chubby little Jewish guy, who got a Distinguished Service Cross for, I think he was with the 24th Infantry Division, for basically manning a machine gun until he was killed, but saving his whole company and what have you. And somebody said this should be upgraded to a Medal of Honor. By the way, this Lenny Kravitz was the uncle of the Lenny Kravitz that you may be familiar with, because that Lenny Kravitz's father was the brother of this Lenny Kravitz's father. Okay, so there you have it. But in any case, there was actually a bill saying, hey, you know, a whole lot of Jewish and Hispanic Korean War veterans really were screwed out of what they deserved with regard to the Medal of Honor. This had happened earlier with blacks in World War II, and we ought to open some cases up. And somebody brought up Tibor's case, and eventually somebody, after being turned down over and over again, somebody looked at this guy's record, all the documentation that was brought up, but there were no officers involved, which is part of the problem, because no officer wrote any of the testimonials or what have you. And it was just all these enlisted men that he helped as a prisoner of war and with I Company and what have you. And they eventually made the case, and ultimately a board said, my God, how could we not do this? And they wrote up this incredible citation. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you all.
I do have a question.
Dr. Goodman,
Yes.
we give you a
Ah,
challenge coin,
thank you.
and we also, this is a copy of a book that a lot of these folks
Yes.
contributed to.
Where's Norm? He gave me,
Yeah, Norman was one of the contributors.
yes.
When you get to the ones I did, if you're having trouble sleeping, they'll help you out.
No, I've had this book,
Oh,
okay?
okay.
Let me, you know,
Thanks, but
give
no
it to
thanks.
someone else. No, I
I
know the
understand.
book, and Norman was, made sure I saw it.
Great. Thank you,
Okay?
sir.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much. Thank you all for coming.